Good evening, everybody. Very warm welcome to this session of AKLF. This session is primarily a tribute to Nabaneeta Devshen, who would have been 85 years old this year. And we just celebrated Nabaneeta De's birthday a couple of days ago. Nabaneeta De needs no introduction, obviously. Nabaneeta De was a novelist, an academician, but she was primarily a poet. And when I tried to connect Nabaneeta De with this idea of translation, let me start with the idea of poetry. I mean, the kind of poetry she wrote and the kind of poetry that she loved, having translated. In the 1960s, there was a book, a collection of Bhakti poetry, originally in Kannada, but Nabaneeta De had it translated, and it was known as Shatek Bachan. Later, much later, in fact, just a few years back, I think, there was in Bangla, I mean, the title was Bangla, all the poems were translated in Bangla, but that was, poetry from different parts of the world. It is known as Shara Prithibir Kobita, poetry of the world. Now that's quite a journey. I mean, from poetry of a particular region and of a particular, and it was religious poetry, Vishaiva poetry. From that to this journey to almost, this was published just a few years, I think, before she passed away. Shara Prithibir Kobita, I think that's a great journey. But it also shows something, it also proves something. It proves that when she is translating, she has a particular kind of objective, a particular kind of plan in mind. There is, an idea of a connection. Initially, it is a certain kind of connection between different parts of India, but later it becomes a connection between different parts of the world. And that is why this session has also been, it also has a subheading, which is Links and Bridges, and this is a tribute to Nabaneeta De. Now, we have with us these three translators, but also publisher, Urvashi, Butalia, and Arunava, of course. We are very familiar with Arunava's work, Sinha, and we have Srinath here. For the first time, Srinath, or have you been to Calcutta before?
I've been here.
Okay. Now, I would first like to ask all three of them, what does translation mean in India today? What position does it occupy in India, modern day India? Because see, we are seeing an explosion of translation. Translation of different kinds of literature, translation of different kinds of text. But from the practicing translators, we would like to know what exactly is happening and what is the thrust in these translations. Arunava, shall we start with you? No, it's alphabetical.
All right, so you can go at the end.
Yeah.
Well, I'm assuming you're talking about translation in literature, because as my colleague Rita Kothari points out, we live our lives in translation in India all the time anyway. So I think, again, you're talking about translation into English.
Into English.
Because we are blessed with more than a dozen languages with flourishing publishing industries of their own, which means ideally we should be having each of these languages publishing translations from at least 10 or 11 other languages within India. Unfortunately, that is not happening at the kind of pace or volume that would be wonderful. The real momentum is still towards translations into English, so maybe we can just limit the conversation to that aspect for now, and then we can then talk about why we need the other one, if you feel. But in English, something very exciting has happened over the past few years, especially when it comes to fiction, which is that translations into English of the non-English languages from different parts of India have taken over the center of English writing and reading in English. So the whole thing, business of reading books in English is now qualitatively, I would almost say, dominated by translations from languages like Malayalam, which is a force of nature at this point of time, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Gujarati, Marathi, Hindi, Urdu, Bangla, Assamese, Odia. So all of these languages are the origins of the books that people are reading in English. So you can imagine how diversified that reading experience is. And it has also, in a sense, forced those who write originally in English to start re-examining what they're writing. So I think it brought about a huge change in the kind of books people are reading, and therefore, by extension, the kind of books people are or will write.
Srinath, I will, because we had this, very slight kind of conversation, and you said that there's a particular reason why you translate. Would you like to repeat for the sake of our audience why you write?
Yeah,
why,
sure.
Or rather, why you translate, not write?
Sure. I started off originally, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, I started off writing in English, and at some point I felt this need to reconnect with my mother tongue, which is Kannada. And at school I had lost my Kannada almost entirely. I went to what I've described in other places as a Hindu convent school. So the idea was to learn English, to wear a tie and so on. And we were actually fined for a brief while for speaking in any language other than English. So there's a kind of mindset that comes with that, and I managed to lose Kannada entirely. And so as an adult, I felt a little rootless and I wanted to reconnect with my mother tongue. And as a result of that, I also knew the author of the first translation I did, Vivek Shanbag, and he was looking for a translator for his book, and I was looking for a project that related to Kannada in some way. And so I decided to give it a shot. And the other ones, one more was published last year and one will be this year if all goes well. So the other ones came about, I guess, because the first one was successful, and without too much intention on my part, they just happened all by themselves, I think. And this is something I see increasingly. Many people thank me because people who speak Kannada at home but don't necessarily read it, or can read a little bit of it but are not comfortable enough with the script that they can read fluently, or have the patience to actually get through a whole book. And so many of them have come and thanked me, and many people who live outside the country. I also noticed that translation into English occupies the space where book reviewers are still treating it with kid gloves to some extent. So books are not critiqued as harshly, I suppose, if they are translated from one of our languages into English. Sometimes they choose to throw the translator under the bus for things that might have been off in the original, but it's okay, I think. So, and it's also seen as something virtuous, I think, now, where people increasingly, find it something, it's a good in its own right to read translations, which is, I think, a wonderful thing.
So there are, am I audible? Yes. So there are two kinds of links that we have talked here. I've not yet come to Urvashi, because that's a different kind of link that, I hope she'll be talking about. But Urvashi, when we are talking about links, okay, Arunava is translating, Srinath is translating, but getting these translations to people, actually, getting them to people and to make them read, that is where a third force, comes in. It is not merely now the translator and the author, or the text and the translator, but there is another thing, another power, another control which comes in, and that is publishing. So insofar, Indian translation scene is concerned, what is the role of the publishers today?
Sucheta, I think that other thing that you're talking about is not really publishing, it's money and the market. That's what it is. In that sense, it applies to translations and to books in English, because the publishing market is a market that is structured in particular ways, and it's very, very difficult for publishers who are not placed as mainstream publishers to even get visibility for their English books. So with translation, it becomes that much more difficult. That's one. So if you look at any bookstall at any airport, you'll hardly see a translation. Mostly it's English, and that comes because publishers pay to put books out there. For us as publishers who publish translations have been very important right from the start, when we started nearly 40 years ago, because we are political publishers, right? So when you are publishing about the women's movement in this country, how can you be publishing only in English? You have to go out of that, right? And the initial steps that we took were moving into what Arunava was talking about, into books in Indian languages which were translated into English. Then we began to think that actually it's equally important for this to happen the other way. And so we started to put out books from Indian languages, from English, feminist books in English into Indian languages. Now it surprises me, I didn't expect this, but it surprises me how much hunger, curiosity, interest there is in small independent publishers for taking what is seen as, I use the word within quotes, mainstream knowledge into their own languages. So one of the most translated books, for example, that we have done is a book of Ambedkarite women in the Maharashtrian movement. Now, it has come from Marathi to English to us, but it's gone from English to Kannada to Tamil to Telugu, and then it is moving to other things. You might argue that this is impure because you are actually going via a language, but I no longer have those kind of scruples. You know, I think it's so important. And really, when we look at international translations, they are actually all going via English. You know, you don't have somebody who can translate directly from Tamil to Croatian. So they will do it via English, but you just don't hear about it. So in that sense, I think that translation today for publishers, and I don't think that it's an exploding, I think we need to do much, much more. But I think it's very, very exciting. And I also think it's really important because translators are the least valued. They need to be paid decent money. And publishers don't have that kind of money. In many countries, translations are subsidized by the state. We don't have that, which may be a good thing now, but, you know, all literary or cultural academies, Sahitya Academy, others, if they were to do it. So right now, there is this wonderful program which is happening in Tamil Nadu, where the Tamil government is taking Tamil literature to the world. So they are, you know, subsidizing translations of Tamil into other languages and taking national literature into Tamil Nadu, so doing it the other way around also. Things like this, which don't cost a lot of money, are really important for our country.
Thank you, Urvashi. Now there is the other thing that people who translate, I don't translate that much. I translate only when I am asked. But there's a question to Arunava and also to Srinath. Translation builds links, builds bridges. I mean, that's a given. That's what everybody talks about. But is translation also disruptive? Would you agree with it, or do you have a comment on it?
I'm not sure. Could you elaborate on disruptive?
Disruptive in the sense, translation, the way it is put usually that it builds bridges, it is kind of, coming together of two texts or two cultures. But there's also, I think there's a subtle kind of power play there.
Right.
Okay, one way, all three of you have mentioned that English, for example, has become the medium through which most Indian literature is getting translated. All right. Because most people, read English. I mean, even if you are in India, you might not read Tamil, you might not read Telugu, you might not read Bangla, but you do read, English. And Arunava made something, he hinted at something, I don't think he had kind of, elaborated either, that it is creating a different kind of literature. Okay, it's a different kind of literature. Now, this different kind of literature, how is it affecting the original? When you write, is it affecting the original?
I'm not sure. I think that depends really on the authors. And as far as I can see, I know several authors in Kannada, and no, I don't think it affects them that way at all. But what you've been saying about translation as link and bridges, it reminds me of something that's happened with the first book I translated, Gachar Gochar, with the author Vivek Shanbag. So he is a Kannada author, but his influences are wide. He reads in English, so he has read the Russians, he has read, authors who write in Hebrew, he has read people in European languages. And through my English translation of his Kannada book, as Urvashi pointed out, you don't have people who translate from Kannada to Turkish or Kannada to Chinese. There may be, but there are so few that maybe they are undiscovered translators as of now. So what happened was, through my English translation, this book has gone into several world languages. So all the major European languages, I think, it's gone into Chinese, it's gone into Turkish, and through English, it even was translated into Nepali. And in some way, there's this quote by Susan Sontag, where she says that translation is the circulatory system of world literature. And somehow that is borne out, I think, when this happens. A circle is completed. So the author's influences, many of those languages now, the sum of those influences can be returned to a part source where it came from. And I think that is beautiful. And perhaps it is disruptive in a very positive way.
Arunava?
Okay, indulge me for a couple of minutes. I was just thinking as I was listening. So the great trend in the world is towards what they call the McDonaldization, right? That everything should taste the same, look the same, feel the same. Because that is where you get scale, you can manufacture or produce at a level at which you can lower the cost of production. And sad to say, big publishing is very similar. So they're also very formula driven, and this works, so let's produce more like this. Let's produce more burgers. Let's not look at anything new or different or innovative and so on. And I'm not even blaming them, because that is the way they operate. Publishing and good books perhaps are no longer mutually compatible, because many publishers, not an Urvashi who does not operate on that plane, but many publishers frankly come and tell you, we think it's a great book, we cannot publish it. And so why are you there then? I mean, I don't understand. If you're there in publishing and you say we can't publish good books because of economic reasons, then that's a different business. So they have what I call book-shaped objects, right? Where you're reading how to improve your life, and no one is telling you that the world is, pardon my French, fucked up, but that it's your problem that you can't get your life in order. So read self-help books, and it's your failure if those self-help books don't help you. So that's the way we are going. So nobody wants anything new, right? And then here comes Srinath and Vivek, and they produce Gachar Gochar. And then you're saying, what am I reading? What is this? I've never read anything like this in English, but I'm reading it in English. Or you read, let's say, a Manoranjan Bapari, who is writing from the street about people who, who take away a dead body for money, and then in order to make more money, they leave that dead body on the side of the railway track so that people passing by will throw a few coins at it. Then after about an hour of this, when they've made enough money, then they take the body to the morgue where they can sell it, where medical students are desperate for dead bodies because they need cadavers to cut up. So nobody's going to write about this in the kind of books that your average English language publisher with big corporate ambitions will publish. So it's totally disruptive. It's disruptive to the point of being deeply uncomfortable. And publishers and editors very often, no offense to them as individuals, but within that system, they don't know what to do with it. And so the book comes out, and it has become a thing now to publish, for example, I'm sorry to say, it's become a thing to publish Dalit literature, because somehow there is this notion that there's a, as you were saying, that there's a virtue signaling that you can do by buying the right kind of books and displaying them on your Instagram. Sorry, I'm bitter today. Displaying them on your Bookstagram. So, you know, but then every publisher is asking translators, do you have Dalit writers in your language whom you can translate? So the Dalit writers don't know it, but they've become a commodity already. And translators are the middlemen who have to take them into the other. So translation is operating in a field which is completely not suited for it. You know, a company like Urvashi, or let's say a company like Sri Shammo, which publishes in Calcutta, yeah, or there are other small publishers like this. Let's say Panther's Paw, which is run out, Yogesh Maitreya runs it. You know, these are the companies who genuinely believe in what they're doing. So they're taking it out there for the real reason. Big publishers are taking many translations out there because they think they will sell. And there is something, I mean, there's nothing wrong with selling. But if your starting point is that it will sell, then I think that's a downhill journey right through. So that's the disruption. And publishers don't like it.
Can I just add to what he's saying? So I think you're absolutely right to say it's disruptive, and as Arunava has said, and I think that's damn good, because literature has to be disruptive. It has to shake you up. You know, as I'm not a translator like he's amazing. You know, even on a plane, he'll do his 2,000 words a day because he has to translate. I have translated one book, but I have to tell you that what that experience did to me was that I now approach every possible book that we might publish in translation from Hindi to English, which I can read Hindi, with great excitement. You know, what am I going to find here? And Arunava, you have talked about Dalit's literature being the flavor of the day, but really the excitement of discovering short Dalit biographies, autobiographies by women, in which they are critiquing patriarchy within their own society and also addressing patriarchy outside. It's amazing that, you know, I really have found it very, very interesting to do that kind of thing. So I think that in a sense, translation really opens up a lot of worlds. And he spoke of middlemen. Let me correct it to middle persons. But there is, and he spoke of Manoranjan Vyapari. So at AKLF on the first day, there was a writer, Dalit writer, who we have just published, called Kalyani Thakur Charal. And when Kalyani gave us her novel, which is like Ghachad Ghochad, you know, really short, it completely shook me because it's got no character, no plot, no, I mean, it's like, it's a series of vignettes of life of people who migrate from what becomes Pakistan to what becomes India, and they settle around a water body, and they live their life around that water body. Completely disrupts this what a novel should be. No character,
exactly.
no plot, no nothing.
I mean, even the generic expectation, what a novel
it's great
should
to have
be,
something like that.
Yes, the range of expectation, that also is, you know, disrupted, obviously.
It's out there, the book, please buy it.
Can I just add something that this reminded me of? Is also that languages have different conventions in them. So, for example, when I translate from Kannada, the idea of literary fiction is not as solid, or in Kannada, and I think this is true of many other Indian languages as well. So there are these registers and conventions that occur in languages and their literatures, and when you translate, you shake those up. A Bolaño translated into English, then and celebrated as a great writer, then you start thinking about what does literature read like. So, and this is also sometimes a problem because many of the conventions of publishing don't match. For example, I think the editing rigor is different in different literary cultures. This may have something to do with money, quite possibly, or it may have to do with
laziness.
Yeah, or sometimes I wondered if it's about being used to some sort of orality in our storytelling and so on, where it's okay, it's fine to repeat something in a slightly different way. But if you repeat a word when you're writing for an English publisher, they are going to swoop down upon it and replace it with a slightly inferior synonym most times. So I think it is also disruptive in these small ways, where you have to reconcile these conventions. And I also found that you have to work gently, because if I start introducing all of these dissimilarities into English, then it becomes unreadable, or it becomes, and maybe after 10 Kannada books are out there, or 100 Kannada books are popular, some of these will slowly, be seen as flavor of some sort, and languages themselves change in terms of what they hold and what is acceptable in them.
Yes, now that you talk of Dalit literature, I mean, both of you have mentioned and referred to it. But, I mean, I also see in certain ways in which Dalit literature, which is exciting, which is, as I said, that which defeats many of our expectations and which is new. Isn't there also a danger, a risk, I almost see it, as being institutionalized, as being brought into the mainstream? I mean, what I mean is that sometimes I see that certain Dalit authors, certain marginalized authors or authors from the marginal communities, they are being translated repeatedly. And to a certain extent, sometimes they become the kind of, the holder of what the identity of Dalit literature, what Dalit literature is supposed to be. But don't you think that translation, or translational activity, it has a great role in discovering, new authors? I mean, so that, the disruption, which is exciting, we don't get used to a certain kind of, literature, though we had called it at some point of time as new, but it is not new. So this search for the new, does translation have a role in that? And if it does, how does it propose to, do it? Sucheta, I'm just jumping in here, sorry. Can you hear me? Mic seems to have gone.
Yeah, okay. So thanks, Srinath. I think that if we always feared what might happen, then we'll never take the risks that are attendant on doing the kind of publishing that really we should be doing in a country like this. So the risks don't worry me. I also think to call Dalit literature new, it's us. That literature has been around for a long time. The thing is, we didn't see it, okay? Now we have started picking it up, and yes, there is, Arunava's pointed out, there is a danger of it becoming institutionalized, but I don't think that matters. I think if people are studying it, if it gets into our universities, if it gets into people's consciousness, if it is there in bookshops, I think what more can we want? I think that's the important thing. Again, in any kind of literature that publishers pick up, so I'll give you my own example. When we started Kali, the first feminist publishing house, nearly 40 years ago, we wanted to publish women's voices, and we started to publish women's voices. It took us maybe a few years to understand that while publishing women's voices in English, so these were all middle class, upper class women like us, was important, it wasn't enough. We had to go beyond that. And why had we been so happy just doing those voices? Because those were invisible in the larger frame of things, but the only ones visible when we went searching. Beneath and beyond that, there were many layers, many hierarchies. And as a publisher, it is your job to seek out those things. So because we are, this panel is in memory of Nabaneeta Di, it's always struck me as so strange that she is such a major Bengali writer, but she's hardly translated into English. Now, in recent years, her daughters and some work has come into English, but her whole sort of lot of work is not really visible beyond the Bengali market. So why is it that people have not picked her up? So in a sense, the job of discovery is like peeling an onion. You find one thing, then you find another layer, then you find another layer. They will always be the most visible stuff, but it's up to you. It's not that fault of that literature. It's your view, that you have to go beyond
Your
that.
failure, yes, exactly. Arunava, you have translated Nabaneeta Di. What did you translate?
I translated her travelogue, Truck Bahone Macmahone, where she went to attend a literary conference in Jorhat, then on an impulse, Nabaneeta Di being Nabaneeta Di, decided to jump into a truck, persuade everybody that she should be accommodated on it, and went off to the McMahon line. And she wrote about it in a usual irrepressible way, discovering things that perhaps the rest of us would never have seen or heard. And she writes about them with tremendous humor and energy, and yet great insights.
But she's also writing it as a woman.
Absolutely.
Okay, now when you are translating it as a man, are you getting what do you feel? You are getting the whole flavor?
I feel I'm being vastly enriched. I think the ability to read a text written by a woman closely for the purpose of translation lets you get some views of the way a particular writer who happens to be a woman is thinking. And I see many spaces where my thoughts would not have gone, or the thoughts of other writers who are male would not have gone. So it's deeply enriching for me also, and not just Nabaneeta Di's work, but the works of many other writers who are women, translating them and reading them closely has convinced me that men think they are far too important in the world, and really women don't need men. I mean, you can see it in their writings. And men just fool themselves into thinking that they're very important. So it's important that every man really understands this.
So this crossing of several margins, actually, even as you have translated. Srinath, I wanted to ask you, something. This is very different. You have translated the autobiography of Girish Karnad. And when you took it up, 3 chapters were already translated by the author, and then you took up the rest of it. How was the experience?
There's this line in an essay by Lakshmi Kannan about translation where which goes that a translator shows only half his face to the world. And I think in this case it had to be less than even half that face, because Girish is so well known and everybody knows his voice. And he had written the book in Kannada, translated part of it into English. And now for me to continue that translation, it would have to be in his voice. If I'm doing the whole book, perhaps it could be some kind of composite, but now that it has started. So, and luckily for me, Girish has spoken about many of the things in his life at length, and these are available as lectures and interviews and documentaries and so on. So I went back to all those sources, and I even had a file on my computer called GK vocab. So for example, if somebody says a word like adbhut, adbhuta in Kannada, but it's the same word. When he spoke in English, would he say, magnificent? Would he say wonderful? What would he actually say? So I had I sort of mapped out his vocabulary to some extent and his cadences, hopefully. And so it was an interesting experience. Yeah.
Yes, but and you were translating Vivek Shanbhag. And you were in consultation with him. You talk to him when you translate, right?
That's right. I had the good fortune of knowing the author. And, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then how did the author respond to your translation, or what was his reaction to your translation? He was okay with whatever you were translating, or did he have anything to add or to?
Yeah, no, we went back and forth, actually. So if there was something, I can't translate something if it doesn't make sense to me, even at the level of fiction or whatever. So I might just pause or even, change it to what I think it should be. And I have the courage to do this because I know Vivek is going to read this. And if it goes against his vision of what he's trying to do, he will let me know. So this gives me the freedom to, translate freely. This is how I think it should flow naturally. Or sometimes a piece of dialogue in Kannada is, sits awkwardly in English, and stands out in a not very good way for the reader. So I might change it slightly or move things around. And I've even done things like move paragraphs to other chapters where I feel they should be, they should occur more naturally. Now, this may be because in English we think in a certain way, and we do.
Exactly, that's what...
And it was great to have Vivek to, consult with on these things. Because with Girish's book, I had to be far more cautious about, it's also non-fiction, so, that it doesn't go against anything that is actually there in the original. But here, and Vivek also took the opportunity to work on the Kannada original. So he went back to his notes, and because we were going back and forth, there were a few scenes that he had wanted to add, but he didn't for whatever reason, so he added them here. And, and he feels that, even in Kannada, the book became better as a result of, this back and forth during translation. It gave him the time to revisit the book in some other way.
Okay, so you mean that when you were translating the interaction with the author, it actually added to the Kannada original?
That's right. The second edition in Kannada is different from the first edition because the translation happened.
Dimension altogether.
Also a very rare thing.
It's a rare thing,
This
exactly.
doesn't happen usually.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen usually. And particularly with Girish Karnad, particularly, we said that he had already translated 3 of the chapters. So you had to maintain a certain kind of parity. You had to almost kind of, walk in his shadows, so to speak. I mean, we often talk about the translator's freedom to a certain extent, which is, often curtailed. I mean, there are obviously debates and arguments about that. But even then, I mean, there's the presence of the text. But, when the text has been half translated, or perhaps not half, but some part of it has already been translated by the original author, I mean, the feeling must be totally, different. I mean...
No, but I guess, every art form you work with constraints, right? And so,
yes,
and in some way those constraints are a form of freedom because you don't have to think along certain axes. So I knew that this has to be in the voice of Girish Karnad, and I don't have a choice in it. So I just have to work towards doing that. So it's also a kind of freedom in its own way.
Mm-hmm. But that's like a building of a new kind of link, I think, because
guess,
I'm still harping on that theme of link. Arunava, has something like this ever happened to you when you translated? I mean,
No, unfortunately, I was just envying Srinath this experience. Although sometimes I'm quite pleased my authors are no longer alive. But, sorry. but no, jokes apart, or seriousness apart, no, it has not happened. And I really wonder what it could lead to something very exciting if it did. And now that I've heard the details, I'm going to try this out with someone. Let's see which author is willing to go through this together.
So, I mean, once more to go back to this, the idea of, disruption. Disruption, as we have, kind of, agreed, that which is positive in a certain way. So that, we often think, okay, translation is building a link. It is a bridge. It is connecting to text. It is connecting to cultures. It is connecting to different people also, author and translator. But we often forget the bridge itself. Okay, we are talking about journeying from this to that, but we are journeying via something. And this bridge now has become visible. The bridge maker has become visible. Something which was absent in the, the earlier days. Or now you agree, I mean, that the translators now are getting more visibility, more recognition. And also the fact that, the very fact that, the most recent phenomenon that comes to mind is, Gitanjali Sri's the translation of Gitanjali Sri's Red Samadhi, and which wins Booker Prize, and which recognizes both the translator and the, the original author. So, but this visibility of the translator, is it happening as widely as we would like it to be? Urvashi, do you think?
I don't know. The straight answer is I don't know. In Gitanjali's case, yes. But that's because it was a big award and the booker has a huge publicity machine to do it. But a lot of the time, no. But for example, with Ghachar Ghochar, you know, because it's such a brilliant translation, because that book has gone all over because of Srinath's translation, or with Arunava's translations of a lot of Bengali work, Anita Agnihotri, various others, you do get a lot of visibility, which is as it should be. Sometimes there isn't visibility. We are running out of time, so I'm going to tell you a little anecdote about a book that all of us are familiar with, Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex.
Exactly. Yeah.
If you know or if you remember, the book was published in the 1960s. The translation was done by a man. He took out huge portions of the book. Now, why did he take them out? My own feeling is, I think he took them out because he thought, this woman, what does she know about philosophy? She's not a philosopher. It's okay to have Sartre, it's okay to have XYZ. Cut out all the stuff about philosophy, so he cut it out. For 60 years, that has been the translation of that book that we have all read across the world. It was only recently that the full text was translated and the bits that were excised were reinserted. I mean, it's not a great translation, the new one, but nevertheless, the guy did not decide for the woman what she could say and what she couldn't say. So there is also this kind of hierarchy in translation that I think we need to watch out for.
And also I think that there should be an organizational effort, conscious organizational effort on the part of, it might be the state, it might be, you know, universities, it might be, you know, bigger institutions, because this is important. Bringing the translator to the limelight. I mean, we often talk about the translation, but how many of us talk about the translator unless the translator has won a, you know, award or, you know, has been recognized in some other way? So to me, it seems that in the Indian scenario, and particularly given that you have so many languages, a concerted, conscious effort on the part of institutions is absolutely necessary if we want to make translations available to everybody and have translations of different kinds of texts from different kinds of communities to bring to the public notice. Arunava, you are in the Ashoka Center of Translation. So, I mean, what are your thoughts?
So, yes, absolutely. I do believe that these things can't be kick-started. They have their natural momentum and it takes a certain period of time for things to happen. You can accelerate them, but you can't really say, I'll do in 1 year what will normally take 5. But what is most exciting for us at the Ashoka Center for Translation is the way young people are taking to translation as a very natural means of expressing themselves and writing. I was just looking at enrollments for my translation workshop, where every student will be finishing a full manuscript in translation in the course of 1 semester. And I've had 30 sign-ups, which means in theory we should have 30 finished translations by the month of May or June this year, which is unbelievable. I mean, you know, a publisher doesn't produce 30 translations in 5 years. So I think it's a very natural mode for us in India because we live in more than one language, and that is how it can become big and bigger on its own. I don't know that institutional intervention will necessarily do that. It has to be a natural need, you know. People just, everyone who wants to write, maybe instead of adding to the noise with their own work, could very well be translating. And there are great precedences here. I mean, all the best-known Bengali poets, for example, you know, were all translators. All of them from Buddhadev Boshudu, Shakti Chattopadhyay, all of them translated works from the West, in this case mostly. So it is a thing. It stopped being a thing, and maybe it will become a thing again. I personally am very hopeful about that.
Just one last.
By the way,
question.
just one quick point. Indian publishers do way better than publishers in the West when it comes to acknowledging translators. So Indian
That's
publishers,
great
for
to
example,
know.
put the names of the translators on the cover, which is a huge movement in the West. Even in the year 2020, translators of Nobel Prize winners and Booker Prize winners were agitating to have their names on the covers.
Okay. And I think I have sort of missed that moment. But you just said that so many young people, they have signed up for the translation course. What do you intend to do with those translations?
Publish them.
Good.
Make people read them. In an ideal world, they'd be available for everybody to read without having to pay. And the money would still go to the translator and the author from somewhere else, but that's perhaps utopian. But I ideally wish that literature could come out of the market structure. I don't know if there's a way to do it, but the market has failed almost every product or service that it has produced, and it is failing literature every single day.
Thank you, Srinath. Thank you, Urvashi. Thank you, Arunava. Can the audience interact?
Or disrupt.
Disrupt, yeah. Can the audience disrupt? If there are any questions, the discussion is now open for comments, questions.
I'm from TTIS and I'm from TTIS, so my question goes to Mr. Sinha. Nabaneeta Debsen was a poet, novelist, travelogue writer and so on. Which of her works attracted you the most?
The story in which she put me, the one she put me in.
Okay.
No, I'm joking. She did write. She was notorious for putting in everybody she knew into her fiction, particularly. So those were always exciting because there was a second level where you identified real people. But I think most of all, what personally I love her fiction the most. I know that her poetry is great, but to me it's her fiction that talks to me.
Actually, she identified herself more as a poet.
As a poet, yes. But also there are works of hers which unfortunately I cannot share with the public because they happened in the privacy of our house and in extremely eccentric circumstances, as you know, Sucheta.
So we know Mrs. Debsen explored different walks of life. She went to Israel to learn Hebrew and so on. So how much of them do you want to follow in your translations?
Sorry, what was the question?
Can you repeat your question?
So Mrs. Debsen explored different walks of life. So how much of them do you want to follow on your work or translations?
Oh, well, I think all of her work should be translated. It doesn't have to be one translator. I don't think one translator can possibly do it either. Almost everything she's written, I think, should be available for people who read in other languages to read as their own.
And which other novelists from Bengali literature do you want to work on?
That we'll do a separate panel on that one.
Okay. And what would be your message to TTIS readers, sir?
Oh, did you do a full interview right now?
Yeah.
Under the guise of questions. What's your message, Srinath?
I have a question for Urvashi actually. So you've
We can talk afterwards.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So you've translated from both text, as with Baby Haldar's book, and from oral narratives. So what sort of, how is the experience different?
Well, I don't know. This is like, I have to think about this. But just off the top of my head, when you are bringing oral narratives into the written word, you are actually simultaneously listening to the words, listening to the silences, sort of absorbing the hesitations and the gaps and respecting where that's coming from. So, for example, if I'm talking to a woman who has lived through sexual assault and she is talking about that, I know that she does not have the vocabulary to describe what she has lived through. And therefore, it becomes important for me to think as a translator, how do I deal with this? You know, do I deal with it in her euphemisms, because it's, or do I deal with it in my feminist thing where you can say these things out loud? And that, I think, is very interesting. How do I deal with silence and so on? Whereas with Baby Haldar's book, and I don't have a lot of experience as a translator, but with Baby Haldar's book, you know, Baby, it's a very strange thing. She wrote that book in Bangla and in Hindi, simultaneously almost. Her Bangla is very Hindiized. I translated it from the Hindi. Now, to me, one of the biggest challenges was, and it's similar to what I'm talking to you about with the oral thing, she experienced terrible violence every day, right? From her husband, from her father. But the descriptions of those violence were completely routine. You know, he beat me, hit me, threw me on the ground, I cooked the food, and I gave him the food, and so on and so forth. And, you know, with me, and as a feminist, inside me, this is churning. How is she not so angry? How is she describing this in a, like it's routine? But for her, it is routine. It's happening every day. So in a sense, you have to enter that frame and try to understand it and work with it. It's a great question, but we don't have time because we are at 0-0, but just a little idea of what that was.
So the session is over, but the discussions need not stop. We can have the discussion outside also. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, the audience.
Thank you.
Thank the
Thank you,
panelists.
Sucheta.